Okay, I think we'll just jump straight in. Good afternoon, everyone. This is the fourth and final webinar in the Advanced Talk series. So thank you all for being here. Obviously, it's the last day of 16 Days of Activism, so a special thank you for being here. So today's session is called A Call for Help, Counter Allegations and the Effects on Future Reporting. Unfortunately, when women report domestic abuse, they are sometimes faced with false allegations from the perpetrator as a means of manipulation or control. And this session will aim to examine some of these issues and discuss the ways support services can help address these challenges. I want to note that this webinar will cover a kind of range of potentially triggering topics, so please do kind of look after yourself and step away from the webinar if necessary. And do use the chat function and the Q&A below to kind of ask questions and pose questions to our panelists, who I will now introduce. So first of all, we have Katie Swain-Williams. Katie is a freelance research and policy consultant specializing in criminal justice reform for women and children accused or convicted of offending. She leads the work at Centre for Women's Justice to seek reforms to prevent the unnecessary and inappropriate criminalisation of victims of domestic abuse and other forms of violence against women and girls. There's Dali Kaur. Dali is the Director of Criminal Justice and Young Women and Girls Services at Advance, and she has over 14 years of experience in the criminal justice system and youth sectors. She has worked within youth offending teams and then within prisons, playing a key role in mobilising and overseeing flagship prison and community-based services. For the last 3 years at senior management level, Dali has been dedicated to supporting women in the criminal justice system through probation, prison and community-based services, and to creating positive change and rehabilitation for women and young girls at risk. And then Amy Glover. Amy is the Director of Domestic Abuse Services at Advance and has only over 15 years experience working in the domestic and sexual abuse sector. She began her career on the Domestic Abuse Helpline and has since grown her skills and expertise, leading to her overseeing child sexual abuse services, accommodation services, perpetrator work, group work, training and therapeutic services, and most recently domestic abuse services at Advance. She is passionate about assessing and developing strategies to end domestic and sexual abuse, including the advocacy of long-term support for survivors and developing perpetrator behaviour change programmes. That was a mouthful, so obviously a lot of expertise here. So the format of this webinar is each of you will get a question, and then we'll go in and I'll ask questions to all of you and jump in how you see fit, or I will target you if necessary. So I'll just start with Katie. Can you tell us a little bit about what we mean by false counter allegations or malicious allegations?
Yeah, so thanks very much for the invitation to take part. I'm going to be drawing mainly in answering this on Centre for Women's Justice's 2022 report, Double Standard. There are other sources of evidence, but that does collate quite a lot of sources of evidence. And at Centre for Women's Justice, in that report, we cited a number of case examples that came from legal inquiries that we'd received over the previous year or so from frontline domestic abuse services. And so I think when we talk about counter allegations, then what we usually mean by that is where a victim of domestic abuse has made an allegation against her perpetrator. So perhaps she's called the police at the scene of an actual incident. Subsequent to that, the perpetrator making an allegation against her. So as a tactic to reduce her credibility and to deflect attention from himself. And there's a lot of research around this. There is actually some police guidance around this as to when police arrive at a scene, how do they then actually identify who is the primary perpetrator. So what will often have happened in these cases is that a woman may have actually used force against her perpetrator in self-defense. So cases arise then where police officers find themselves having to decide who is the primary perpetrator. And unfortunately, in a lot of the cases that we see, they're not making the right decisions in those cases, and women become labelled as a perpetrator. And in fact, I think in your briefing paper, Leonie, you cited Marianne Hester's research, so the University of Bristol, who she published her research in 2012. And that research found that in cases where an allegation was made against a woman in these circumstances, women were 3 times more likely than men to be arrested. And that really reflects the pattern of what domestic abuse service providers tell us and what we see in terms of the likelihood really of women finding themselves arrested when they've actually called for help from the police. And of course, that's the problem I think you're trying to get at. One more thing to mention, there's obviously a lot more that I could say, but is research by the Howard League for Penal Reform, which was published a couple of years ago. And that was based on evidence from 5 police forces, which showed that 40% of arrests of women resulted in no further action. Now, and a large proportion of those were domestic abuse incident arrests. And you might think, well, okay, so what's the problem? There's no further action, then that's okay. But actually what that reveals is a massive overuse of arrest. And of course, the experience of arrest in circumstances like that is incredibly traumatic for women and for any children who may be present or who may be impacted by the mother's absence and detention. And as you've pointed out, the impact in terms of the likelihood of women actually calling for help on a future occasion.
Absolutely. And I'm sure Amy and Darley will be able to kind of utter that just from the work that we do. So Amy, how common are kind of counter allegations or false counter allegations, and how do they impact women's willingness to report abuse in the future?
So we see in our services that this happens frequently. You know, I think Katie's already alluded to that. This happens really frequently. There's a few different ways that it manifests. The most common way being as Katie described. So, you know, the police are called out to an incident, and the perpetrator there may sort of try and provide the narrative that there's violence both ways, or that she is in fact the primary perpetrator, and do that as a tactic to avoid arrest or further action, or obviously to get her arrested. What we often see as well is counter allegations being used, and then the police recording the offence as what they term a non-crime domestic. So that's where they have sort of come to the conclusion that it's potentially a sort of he said, she said scenario, and their ultimate conclusion is, oh, there's no crime here. This is a relationship dispute. We see a lot of cases coming to us with that terminology used, and that in itself can be damaging terminology for a victim survivor to hear that, oh, this is a relationship issue. This is not something for the police to be involving themselves with. We also see perpetrators where there may have been multiple police call-outs, sort of almost trying to get in there first. So sort of as Katie described with incidents of what we term violent resistance, where she may have used self-defense. The perpetrator may kind of provoke an incident of self-defense and then immediately either pull their phone out to record what's happening or immediately call 999. And then, of course, the police are going in with a preconceived idea of who the primary perpetrator is in that scenario. And so there's an inherent bias there when they turn up, even if she then tries to present her narrative of her being the primary victim in that scenario. In terms of the impact on willingness to report abuse, I mean, obviously, as Katie's already said, it has a huge impact on people's willingness to report abuse. So we know that for women who are experiencing abuse, the response from the first professional they tell is vital in determining whether or they'll ever seek support again. So if there's a situation where there's counter allegations or and where those counter allegations are being taken seriously, this may well have an impact of her not feeling she can call the police in future. The other thing to say is that we know that risk increases where women seek help. So if she has called the police and they have come and there's been a counter allegation and that has been taken seriously, what actually might happen is the abuse escalates for her because he hasn't been arrested, he hasn't been removed from the home, or maybe she's even been arrested and then returned. And so she will then see the police or any agency that she's told as making things more dangerous. So why would she report? Because reporting is making things less safe for her. And also on the extreme level, I think it's also worth just mentioning the impact of coercive control and gaslighting on this whole narrative. So women in long-standing coercively controlling relationships will have a narrative constantly pushed on them that the abuse is their fault. And so if the system then starts to reinforce that, what we then have is a situation where she may actually feel that it is her fault. So she may stop seeking support because actually by the police getting involved and by a counter allegation being taken seriously, that perpetuates the narrative that, oh no, I am to blame after all. And that again may mean that she's less likely to report in future.
Yeah, and I mean, on Darley, on your side, if this is carried through and the woman has been arrested. I mean, how much of a problem is this in the criminal justice work that you do? And how often are women being falsely, or maybe in some cases not falsely accused, but the narrative is changing because of the context with the work that you do?
Thank you, Leonie. So following on from Amy and Katie's, I mean, there's some key points there which give prime examples of how women come into the CJS system. So following on from that, I think counter allegations are known challenge within the CJS system, criminal justice system, especially in cases where DA domestic abuse is involved. Unfortunately, we have seen cases where false prosecution of women are being misunderstood or manipulated. Through our experience, often means that these women are more likely to face prosecution. So, for example, over 60% of the women in prison have experienced domestic abuse. 70% of these women, supported through our advanced criminal justice services, have similar experiences or have shared those experiences with us. And this is through custody directly or indirectly through custody, through abuse. We've seen a number of cases come through our diversion service, which is our service which works within the police custody suites, where women have reported that they've been victims of domestic abuse. And also we have our CRS services, which is our community rehabilitation services in prisons. And when we carry out our initial assessments, these women have shared with us their reasons for their mental health deteriorating, reasons for self-harm. And what we've seen is working closely with them, that these women have had years of abuse where it's taken place. And only because agencies, organisations like ourselves have gone in there and spent time with them to unpack what's going on. And they have given us sort of reasons of what's similar to what Amy and Katie have said, that around they've called the police out, and from that they have been wrongly accused. So there is this sense of bias, misinterpretation of evidence, of counter allegations made by the perpetrator. And we have seen that this can be a tactic to avoid accountability and shift blame on the woman. And there's a big power dynamic here as well. And if you don't have the training or the skill set to identify this at point of arrest or during the court system, it can be hard. So this results in women not trusting in the system, resulting in arrest. We have seen cases where some women have been placed in custody due to them being a risk to themselves and the mental health. But actually, when you further explore, DA has taken place. We have examples. So example A is a woman with addiction, mental health needs, after years of abuse, who remained in the relationship due to her needs, and the perpetrator used this as a form of control. And in this, he claimed that he was the primary victim of abuse. In example 2, we have seen through our supported diversion service, woman B was arrested for criminal damage, and after released with no further actions, and told us that she called the police as she felt unsafe from her ex-partner. And when the police arrived, he made allegations against her and she was arrested. One of the key things here is for the women, because of the lack of trust and fear, and there is this sense that social services will be involved. And from that, they will get a sense that they might lose their children or their children will be removed, which can result in the woman feeling trapped in her relationship. But through our services, we have seen that it's not just a point of arrest. This can take place throughout our services, and even women disclosing in women's centres, and us trying to work with our joint up services of domestic abuse to try and identify and support the woman forward.
I mean, you all touched on it slightly, but what are the kind of implications on a woman's mental health when they're kind of going through this, whether it's that they're arrested and it is no further action, or if they actually do go through and are arrested and charged? Anyone can jump in. If not, I'm more than happy to pick someone.
I think it can impact, the mental health will be impact from way before arrest, because as you know, it can take place through years. So that whole, which Amy touched on, gaslighting, the whole making the woman feel that she's not worthy, and obviously using the children as a tool. I think that's a key element, and that can have an overall impact. And what that can lead to is isolation and the woman not engaging in services. But once conviction takes place and women come out, they face, we call like a secondary trauma. So that can impact their mental health, physical health, and practical things like housing, education if they're in employment and they have a criminal record. The long-term impacts are quite severe and quite serious, which can then result in them forming forms of addiction as well. So a way to manage their feelings and their emotions, and especially where children are involved, that loss and bereavement and that separation can cause long-term impact.
Yeah, and Katie, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I mean, just building on that last point that Dali's made, I think that, there's a huge amount of evidence about which any of us can imagine the separation from children, even for one night separation from children, unexpectedly, traumatically on detention, but for a prison remand or sentence is absolutely horrendous. And the statistics show how just shockingly prevalent self-harm and suicide are in women's prisons, and the impact of that trauma of separation from children. And as Dali's indicated, I mean, the implications are totally devastating on every aspect of women's lives if they're criminalised. Even if they're just arrested and then released without charge, immediately that has implications for any family proceedings around the children. Yeah, it's just getting that first thing wrong has incredibly damaging implications for women's mental health and actually their practical situation.
Absolutely. Amy, did you want to?
No, I think nothing else for me to add. I suppose it's just back to what I was saying about like we've already mentioned, the impact of the system that's meant to be keeping you safe being complicit in your abuse, and how that as an experience can just completely erode your own sense of reality and your own sense of self, and how do you even recover from that, and then of course all the practical stuff falls in around you as well, around losing access to children. And I think it's worth mentioning, even though we're talking predominantly around sort of criminal justice and counter allegations today, the impact of counter allegations in family court systems and family justice systems, and how that intertwines with counter allegations in criminal justice to sort of further create barriers for women, and in the worst case scenario result in them having limited or at extreme no contact with their children.
Yeah. And I mean, in those cases, I mean, what role do criminal justice agencies play in being able to navigate counter allegations? And I guess I'll double that up with, how can they differentiate between legitimate and malicious claims from perpetrators? Amy, should I start with you?
Sure. So I think differentiating between legitimate and malicious allegations, I suppose one thing I think, if we're thinking about police and criminal justice, is police work in a very incident-based way. So they will see, so if we give the example of the perpetrator who, for example, sort of pushes an incident of self-defense and then pulls out his phone and records it and then sends that to the police. That is, as far as the police can see, an incident of a crime, right? An incident of assault or whatever it might be. And I think that what the police still need to do a lot of work to try and do is recognise that what domestic abuse is it's a sustained pattern of behaviour. And actually, a lot of things that happen in domestic abuse, if you take them as incidents in their own right, aren't actually necessarily crimes in their own right. But when you put them together as a pattern, they are a crime. They're a crime of coercive control or of abuse. So I think there's a lot of work for criminal justice agencies to do to understand what patterns of abuse look like and how perpetrators manipulate systems to try and make that work in their favour. There's also some sort of behavioural differences we see between legitimate victim survivors and perpetrators who are presenting as victim survivors. So, you know, things like guilt and self-blame are things that victim survivors experience really acutely and will often talk about. Perpetrators who are presenting with counter allegations don't usually reference that. Perpetrators are more likely to weaponize vulnerabilities of victim survivors. So, for example, blame her conduct on her mental health, on her substance use, you know, things like that. And I think a big thing we often overlook is fear. You know, who's frightened in the dynamic, because often that's quite plain to see, and actually fear is the best indicator of who's actually at risk in that scenario.
Yeah, and Dali, can you kind of expand on that from a criminal justice point of view?
I think for the CJS handling, I think it's important that prosecutors and investigators are trained correctly to assess cases, identify where sort of manipulation is taking place. So we look at victim blaming. Missteps, as we know, can result in miscarriages of justice. And I think one of the key things is thorough investigations, actually, like Amy's saying, looking at the whole case, the whole picture, and the power dynamics. I think one of the things that we've seen over our experience of running these services is years of abuse can result in a woman displaying anger, violent behaviour. And that can be misinterpreted because she's not sort of coming across as a typical victim. So it's about sort of understanding that and the reasons for that. And I think one of the key things is relationships and developing partnerships around sort of different organisations, and understanding that throughout this work journey, the women known to other services? Have they previously engaged in other services? I think in order to prosecute, the investigation needs to be quite thorough, and only then can you take a step forward. So I think better training around in prisons, in the voluntary sector, across police, across sort of a broad range which matches sort of what an experience can look like for a woman.
Yeah, absolutely. And Katie, could you add any more to that, kind of what the role of the criminal justice agencies can play in navigating that?
Yeah, I mean, again, just building on Dali's last point, I think we think that people have a better understanding of domestic abuse than they actually do. And I think a lot of it is very basic stuff. To us, it seems basic because we're working in this world. But, you know, we've talked a lot about the police, and Dali's, you know, highlighted prosecutors as well. And I completely agree with all of that around the need to actually really understand the circumstances at the beginning. But it goes throughout the process. So, you know, we also have cases where the case has gone to court, and, you know, magistrates are refusing to hear evidence about a context of abuse. You know, I've got one example here that we had in the double standard report, which was, it came from a blog published by the Prison Reform Trust, Sarah Beresford, on Russell Webster. And in this case, a young girl, Roxy, describes, I'd heard my stepdad screaming and shouting at my mum loads of times before, and I knew he hit her, though we never spoke about it, but this time felt scary. I came downstairs and he had her by the throat in the kitchen. It all happened really fast. I just remember mum picking up a frying pan and whacking my stepdad over the head with it. Neighbours called the police. Roxy's stepfather was taken to hospital with a serious head injury, and her mum, Trish, was charged with assault occasioning actual bodily harm, which resulted in a 6-month custodial sentence sentence. Her history of experiencing years of domestic abuse at the hands of her partner was not mentioned in the pre-sentence report. Like many women, Trish had been afraid to disclose what was happening for the fear that her 3 children would go into care. You can't believe it, but she got 6 months in prison, you know, and that's not an unusual sort of case that we're describing. So there's just a very fundamental and basic failing throughout the whole criminal justice process to actually look at the proper circumstances that the victims are facing in these cases.
Absolutely. And I suppose that's a really good place to kind of think about what those systemic micro macro changes need to be in kind of ensuring that counter allegations or false counter allegations are not deterring women from reporting abuse or for them to get help in the first place. Anyone want to jump in, or Katie?
Yeah, go on then. I will jump in. So I think, I mean, Dali has talked about the importance of partnerships between agencies, and I think that's really fundamental. You know, that the police, obviously they need better training, then they need better guidance as well. But that's, you know, that can just go in one ear and out of the other. So, you know, I think the evidence really does show that they need to be working in close partnership with expert services on a day-to-day basis. And what they also need is to be held accountable. So there needs to be accountability for police, for prosecutors, for everyone in the system, for actually prioritising this and getting it right. And when it isn't got right, that there's some follow-up to that. And I think part of that could be assisted through more multi-agency local governance of these sorts of cases. So specialist domestic abuse courts, which you know, Advance has obviously been involved with in London, are one model, which is a slightly different context, but my understanding from speaking to IDVAs is that where women face proceedings in specialist domestic abuse courts, they get a much more nuanced and effective hearing than if they're in a just routine standard magistrates court. So one suggestion that I would make and that we have made at CWJ, and it would be that there is more multi-agency governance. So where the courts, the police, the women's specialist services, everybody understand that they're all trying to get a better response, a more just outcome in these cases by working together to improve their knowledge and understanding and thereby their response to it.
Absolutely. And obviously, yeah, we do work in specialist domestic abuse courts with Stand Together, which, you know, has great outcomes. Amy, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I think, yeah, specialist domestic abuse courts was absolutely what I was going to say. So thank you, Katie. I think it's the specifically trained workers, and Dali's talked about training, but it's the work and it's the, you know, we have Standing Together coordinating that specialist domestic abuse court. So we have a specialist agency in there, seeing the cases, seeing the outcomes, reviewing the quality. And then what we've got is the buy-in from everybody. So we have meetings with everybody involved, you know, so everyone's on the same page. And I think it's fundamental, really, to changing behaviour. I also do think, you know, I think that from police, I think there's a need for sort of a cultural shift for police. I remember speaking to officers when they talked about, I remember speaking to officers once who talked about the fact that police actually investigating domestic abuse is not, for a lot of police, what they went into the force for, because it doesn't come with a lot of outcomes necessarily. And police are often outcome driven. They want the charge, the conviction, that's how they're monitored and measured often. And what we know about domestic abuse often is it's very difficult to get those outcomes. And actually, they're not even necessarily the primary outcome that a victim survivor always even wants. But there is a key role for criminal justice to play in improving safety and helping women to report when they want to. So I think if we could shift away from looking so much at outcomes and, oh, look, a conviction here, I think we wouldn't be so vulnerable to counter allegations as a sort of criminal justice system. So I think that would be a really great cultural shift to see.
And Dali, yourself?
Yeah, touching on Amy's point, I think if we go right back to the beginning, one of the key things is about ensuring that the woman feels confident and has that building of trust and reducing fear. So before the perpetrator can go to the police, the woman's already been. I think that also is key and important, that she feels that she's able. And I can, similar to what Amy says, that's only going to come with a cultural shift of building that trust, of having, you know, that awareness that they can approach different services, be that the police or other services, and say, actually, this is taking place. And I do feel that there is also training around a cultural awareness, that it might just not be one person as well. It could be a family where one person who is the primary victim. So when the police do go in, we have a lot of women saying that they don't say anything because they're being asked around family or children. So being aware of that, what that family dynamic is as well, that would the woman want to answer the questions that are being put forward in front of family members, and could they be perpetrators as well? So I think there is this general training and building of confidence for women to engage in services such as the police and other services, where they can ring and approach them when help is needed.
I mean, and on that kind of criminal justice side, how much is a woman's contact with the criminal justice previously, whatever, you know, her offence was, affect her ability to be able to report in the future if she is experiencing domestic abuse? Just in terms of, I guess, stigma and kind of stereotypes there.
So like I said, there is this lack of sort of engaging justice system. There might be sort of areas of substance misuse that might have taken place, or areas where sort of mental health has deteriorated, but that is due to long-term abuse. So we are seeing that sort of those that have been prosecuted due to counter allegations, they've not been in contact, but they have reached out to the police and no further action might have been taken, or they've sort of dropped those charges. And for us, it's about, are you investigating the whole picture?
Yeah, and on that, I know we've kind of spoken about it already, but just in terms of the strategies of perpetrator, I know you spoke about technology and social care. I wonder, Katie, Amy, if you could just expand a little bit on what those tactics look like. And of course, it, you know, as you mentioned, it doesn't just have to be in terms of criminal court. It can be in terms of, you know, calling the police as a tactic to kind of not manipulate, but to use against a woman in family court. Amy, are you happy to jump in?
Yes. I think one thing that it's really important not to underestimate is the ability of some perpetrators to manipulate professionals, and the ability of perpetrators to manipulate professionals so that professionals become accidentally complicit in abuse. And that happens with all professionals. It can happen with police during a call out, it can happen with social workers, it can happen. And, you know, we also see tactics of perpetrators. We see perpetrators sometimes trying to access our domestic abuse services, because what better way to present yourself, to present the narrative of you as the victim in that scenario, in the context then of further counter allegations, if you manage to get yourself an independent domestic abuse advocate, and you're able to say, well, I've got an IDFA, so I'm obviously a victim here. And so we also have to be quite careful about, you know, obviously always maintaining that we believe people that come to seek our support for services, but where things don't feel right for some reason, making sure we're doing the necessary assessments to work out who is doing what to who in that scenario. But I think, yeah, the manipulation of professionals for me is a key thing we see frequently with all professionals. And what we also know is, you know, Dali was talking about this earlier, but legitimate victim survivors will be presenting often with a trauma response, and trauma response manifests in a lot of ways. You know, we know fight, flight, freeze, etc. It might manifest in her being quite aggressive and quite angry. It might present of her feeling quite chaotic. She might not remember dates. She might not know what's going on in that moment. Whereas perpetrators are going to likely present a lot calmer, a lot more in control, have a lot clearer narrative. And that can work in their favour, unfortunately, when we're looking at counter allegations.
Yeah, and Katie, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, I'd agree with all of that. And you know, another example from our double standard report was the case of Maya. Again, not her real name, and Maya was in a situation which is particularly vulnerable in that she is a migrant woman without British citizenship. So this gives perpetrators an additional tool and power over women to bring the state in again as a sort of colluding party to increase her fear and vulnerability. And in this case, Maya was arrested for common assault and assault by beating in response to a counter allegation by her husband, who had previously attempted to strangle her, and who was the primary perpetrator in the situation. They had young children. She was arrested and she was given a bail condition not to have contact with the children, who were aged 3 and 7. She was on police bail for 2 to 3 months before being charged. And during that period, there are also family proceedings underway. Maya's husband tried to pressure her into an agreement to allow him full custody of the children. And on one occasion, he even emailed the police to indicate that he was seeking to negotiate with her solicitors over their divorce agreement, but that he would want to pursue charges if her solicitors weren't receptive to his terms. And incredibly, you know, that did not then trigger a complete rethink by the police. The matter dragged on for some period of time. She was actually convicted of one of the offences, and then it was quashed on appeal. But that gives you some indication of how far perpetrators can actually, even openly in that case, be manipulating police officers.
Absolutely. I mean, I know we've had cases where a perpetrator has had a counter allegation or a false counter allegation, and they were able to get a non-molestation order, so a protective order, and then would manufacture situations in which that woman would break that order, and a lot of the time it would be meet this child, or meet, you know, whatever it may be, and then obviously that was then used within family court proceedings. So obviously
that's actually happened in Maya's case, exactly that, where she was tricked into meeting them in the park, and he then contacted the police, you know, alleging a breach of a non-molestation.
And I suppose in those situations, I mean, from our point of view, obviously we would want police to kind of investigate every breach of a non-mol or a non-molestation order, or kind of any protective order. So and going back to that, what can criminal justice agencies do? What is it in that moment that a criminal justice agency should do, whether it's the police, to kind of investigate that? I mean, it might be repeating what we said before, but I mean, how do they see that in that moment?
I think there just needs to be a more sophisticated response to the whole situation. So I'm just thinking of another case. We've got some short films that we published at Centre for Women's Justice, which you can find online on our website. And one of them was a story of Jane, who was prosecuted. We don't have time to go into the details, but she was prosecuted following an allegation by her long-term abusive partner over use of a banking app while they were separating. And she sort of, this dragged on for about 2 years before the CPS dropped it. But meanwhile, she had already begun pursuing a case of coercive control against him. And there was just a series of failings in the investigation of that offence, which ended up with the police completely dropping the allegations against him. And it was actually to do with a mistake they'd made about the period of time for which they gathered evidence. So it was a misunderstanding of the law, basically, a mistake by the police. And the situation that Jane was in was that she had one police officer dealing with her allegation of coercive controlling behaviour. And then when this counter allegation was made, a separate police officer dealing with that. And they just weren't communicating with each other. You know, there was it was just incompetence, actually, apart from anything else. And so, I mean, that's just an example, but I think in answer to your question, just need a much more effective and competent look at the whole situation. And there's just no substitute for that. And of course, that does mean putting resources into this. as well as all the other, you know, the culture change and everything else that's needed, and the close work with specialist organisations who, of course, can help to provide that resource, as long as, of course, they receive the funding that they need to do that. But everybody's game just needs to be raised that much to actually respond to the real situation that's in front of them.
Yeah. Does anyone have anything they would like to jump in at there, Darlie or Amy? If not, I'll go on to our last question.
No, I was just going to say, from what Katie said, it's really important. And I think one of the main fundamental things is, what I find quite shocking, is not listening.
Mm.
And by listening to the woman, you know, and gathering that form of evidence and that story, going back and having a look, did that take place? I know that resources are really short, staffing levels are really short across all sectors and across everything. But I think sometimes, like, our support from the charity sectors or third sector organisations is around wraparound trauma informed, and disclosures do come from the woman. But I think that time spent of listening and then following up is key and important, like Katie says, because from that, you can then gather the evidence and gather the support needed to make that judgment. And also, I think at point of sentencing as well is key. It is really key that you don't just follow the sentencing guidelines. You look at what they're saying and what the evidence is saying, because if you're going according to what the sentencing guidelines are saying, you know, women will go into prison if this is taking place. But taking on board sort of other factors, I think, is really, really important. So I'd say at the point of sentencing as well is really important, and screening at point of arrest as well.
Yeah, and you've actually answered some of the question I was going to ask, but obviously feel free to add to it. Was, you know, what is a best practice when you're supporting those women, whether it's on the domestic abuse side or on the, well, they both interlink, but whether it's on our domestic abuse services or criminal justice services, like what does that best practice look like, whether it's whatever part of their journey they're in? And I suppose for you, Darlie, diversion would play a big part to that, and pre-sentence reports, which obviously you mentioned. I'll let you kind of expand there, and then I'll go on to Katie and Amy, and then we'll be finishing.
Yeah. So I was going to say early intervention and prevention, which is like through our diversion services. I think that's key, you know, so sort of identifying that even before it goes down sort of the sentencing or the CPS or prosecution. If that is done correctly and those paths are followed and that support is followed, then the woman wouldn't have to go through that trauma of going through the CPS route. And if in those cases you are going to go down the CPS route because there's actual sort of, you know, harm taken place, it is important on the day of sentencing or on the day that, like I've said, that support is available. And it's not just one shoe fits all. This is what I'm going to give you because this is what the book is saying that you should receive. And we have a lot of women in custody in prisons who are saying, at point of sentencing or at point of arrest, I was trying to communicate and say that this is going on. Then they go into prison and their mental health deteriorates, that they can't even do appeals or see their children because they've got to the point where their mental health has deteriorated that much and self-harm has taken place. And unfortunately, like Amy will know, and Katie, in some cases, suicide does take place, and which is really sort of what could have been prevented wasn't. So I think it's about prevention and what can be done at the very early stages to identify that some form of abuse or something has been taking place.
Absolutely. And Katie, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I just recognise all of that Darlie said, and I think as well as support, what's clear from the research that we do is the advocacy by services for women and the critical role that plays. So the cases where you do see unusual outcomes where proceedings are begun and then they stop eventually, it's often because there's a worker there from a women's specialist service who is advocating on behalf of that woman to the police, to the Crown Prosecution Service, to anybody they can get hold of, to get them to see the actual evidence and a proper picture. And actually just joining the dots, of that case I just described where police officers weren't speaking to each other. So I think the role of advocacy from specialist services, both for individual women, but also as to other services sort of as part of the system. So in that multi-agency model that we've described, the specialist domestic abuse courts, those services can provide that expertise that is then useful as sort of at a systemic level, and for individual professionals, so police officers who need a guidance on a day-to-day basis. So I think advocacy in individual cases and systemically by women's specialist services is just absolutely key.
Absolutely. And Amy, do you want to kind of have the final word there?
Happy to. Yeah. Yes, I agree with Katie's point, obviously, about women's specialist services. I think my final point, just to circle back to something we've already talked about, is until we have a system that is competent in identifying who primary perpetrators are in situations, we are not going to have a system that changes when it comes to counter allegations. So until we have, the nuance that Katie talked about, and until we have this really clear narrative and a system that is fully trained and all working from the same page of how domestic abuse manifests and how we can identify who is doing what to who and who is the primary aggressor, things won't change. So I suppose for me, that best practice is making sure that, whatever, if you are a professional in any place where you've come across victims, survivors of domestic abuse, or might come across counter allegations, making sure you are upskilled and you do understand that dynamic. Or if you don't, where to go and who to ask for advice where you get counter allegations, to make sure that the first response is the right one.
And I think that's a great end, great way to end. We're just a few minutes over, but otherwise I think we've done that in good time. So thank you, Amy, Dali, and Katie. I'm sure there was a lot more we could probably discuss, but 45 minutes is how we've set these webinars. Thank you everyone for joining. This is obviously the last in this series, and I will share kind of insights in the recording from this session next week. But do email if you have any questions. Okay, thank you.